last days, again and again, the question has been asked of us, where are we? What is this place where heaven and earth, existence and non-existence, permanency and impermanency, and we can even add to the inner and the outer meet. But there are several anecdotes and an old story that allow another question to be asked of us, which needs to be answered before we can answer the question, where are we when heaven and earth meet? But first, there's a distinction in language. Perception and apperception. Perception is that which is arrived at via sensory awareness, and apperception is that which is arrived at by direct experience. Over these last days, there's an opportunity to watch on Gaia the story of that man who you will probably remember, Uri Geller, who was known for his ability to be able to bend spoons and have others bend spoons. But in telling his story, he relates that he was taken by these organizations, the Mossad, the CIA, and the FBI, who wanted to use his powers. And he relates that there was an occasion when those corporations, organizations, whatever we might call them, asked him to use his ability to ignite an atomic device, and he refused to do so. There was another occasion when he was put in a room with a pig, and they asked him to use his power to stop the heart, to kill the pig, and he refused to do so. And the upshot of what he is describing, he states very clearly that he knows that there is a power that does not allow him and has not allowed him to misuse that power. And it reminded me of a personal experience, not the same, but giving a certitude, because there was that point in my own life where I surrendered. I surrendered to a voice in my head that had said, if I speak to you of earthly things and you don't believe me, how will you believe me if I speak of spiritual things? And from that point, there was a continuing process of surrender and obedience. But out of that, from that moment when that voice spoke and the decision was made to surrender to it, there was an absolute knowing that there was something that was taking care of it, that I could not go astray, that it was being taken care of. Now, just to throw into the mix, there's that old story about the young boy called Krishna. And he'd been born to parents who were in their dotage. They were very old, so from the earliest age, he found himself taking care of them. But one day, when he was on an errand in the town. A horseman came into town, asking of everyone, who will sacrifice their child to save the king and the kingdom? And without a moment's hesitation, Krishna stepped out into the middle of the road to stop the horseman and said, I will sacrifice myself to save the king and the kingdom. And the messenger said to him, but you're a young boy, you have to get permission from your mother and father. And he said very wisely, I have had many mothers and fathers, and I know that they will be taken care of them. I offer myself as the sacrifice. But please, sir, won't you tell me why there needs to be a sacrifice? The messenger alighted from his horse, and taking Krishna's hand, he led him over to a nearby tree, and they sat down. And the messenger told the story. You know that our young king is very fair and kind, and it is also known that he has longed to find a queen, but has been unable to do so. But it so happened that several days ago, whilst he was out on a hunt in the forest, chasing a gazelle, he was separated from his troop and found himself lost in the dense forest. He and his horse were thirsty, so they stopped at a stream to drink. And while the king was drinking, he happened to see further down the stream a maiden more beautiful than he had ever known, bathing. He fell instantly in love, and he followed her and found that she belonged to a small community that had gathered around an old sage, an old hermit, you might say. Now, the king, totally besotted and fearless, went up to this sage and asked for his daughter's hand in marriage. And the sage said to him, yes, if my daughter accepts you, you may be wed, on the condition that you undertake never to harm any creatures of this forest again. Readily the king said that he obeyed what had been said. So that very evening the wedding took place. But the next day, when the king was taking his new bride back to his forest, it was a long day, and night fell before they had reached the outskirts of the forest. So they settled down under a great tree, where they consummated their union. But in the morning, when the sun was coming up, suddenly the sun was obliterated by a great shadow, darkness, And when the king looked up, it seemed to have the form of a demon, a ghoul, or something of that nature. And it spoke, "How dare you enter my domain without asking permission? How dare you undertake a union without giving me obedience? For this you must be punished. If you do not bring to me a child to be sacrificed within the next days, I will destroy you, your wife, your palace, your kingdom." And so the tale of the messenger came to an end. But the very next day, an entourage of soldiers came to take Krishna and his mother and father deep into the forest, where it had been directed that the child would be offered up on an altar in the place where the king and his bride had been. Now, when they arrived at that location, and the altar was set up, and Krishna was laid out, his father at his head, and his mother at his feet, and as directed, the king standing beside the altar with his sword raised to undertake the sacrifice. Now all of this occurred under the shadow of that great force, standing over, directing, it might be said, what was happening, when suddenly Krishna began to laugh. And all of a sudden, out of that great dark shadow, a great booming voice asked, "Why are you laughing?" And Krishna replied, "I'm laughing because when one is in deep trouble, one would go to one's father and mother. And here I am on an altar to be sacrificed with my father at my head and my mother at my feet. When we do not obtain an answer or aid from our parents, we go to the monarch, to the king, to the leader, and here is the king holding his sword above my chest to make the sacrifice." But an amazing thing happened. As Krishna's laughter rang out through the forest, everything began to laugh. The branches of the trees, the birds twittering with laughter, the grass waving in laughter, the distant mountains shaking with laughter. Suddenly, there was no darkness, no shadow. So the question that arises out of these anecdotes and this old story, to enable us to know that place where heaven and earth, existence and non-existence, constancy and inconstancy, and the inner and the outer meet. We know the difference between perception and apperception. We know the difference between sensory awareness and direct experience, which in other words, using my parlance, is knowing without question, resting in a place of knowing. Direct experience of knowing. Who hasn't had it? So is it a meeting place? A meeting place of sensory awareness and direct experience? Do perception and apperception come together in this place? Life, outer life, and inner life? What say you? What's your experience? Certitude. No questions, no debates. Knowing that something, not outside ourselves, is in control, cannot allow us to go astray, cannot allow us to misuse. What say you? What is it? What would you call it?